Hello, everybody. It's very nice to be able to welcome you back to this month's IHF webinar, which is about the Shahnameh. I hope you all enjoyed our last webinar, where the whole curatorial team took it in turns to talk about aspects of the Epic Iran exhibition. And I'd like to take this opportunity to tell you that our next webinar on Wednesday, the 9th of June, will be about Zoroastrianism. And on that occasion, Khojasti Mystery will be describing the beliefs, history and rituals of Zoroastrianism in conversation with Sarah Stewart and Malcolm Debu. Well, as you will have realized, our recent and forthcoming webinars have been linked to the Epic Iran exhibition at the Victoria and Albert Museum, which is co-organized by the V&A and the IHF in association with the Sarikhani collection. And today's no exception. But before introducing today's lecture, I should remind you that the Epic Iran exhibition opens to the public on 29th May and runs through until September. And we hope that as many of you as possible will be able to visit the exhibition in that time. Well, today's webinar is entitled Kings and Heroes, Lovers and Poets, the Shahnameh's Continuous Appeal. And the speakers are Professor Charles Melville, in conversation with Ina Sarikhani Sandmann. Charles has been the president of the British Institute of Persian Studies since 2018. During that period, BIPS, as it's known, has gone from strength to strength, and I hope that many of you listening today are actually BIPS members. So welcome, Charles. Charles is also a member of the IHF's academic committee. He's Emeritus Professor of Persian History at Cambridge and an Emeritus Fellow of Pembroke College. And he's the founding director since 1999 of the Cambridge Shahnameh project. Ina is the director and co-founder of the Sarikhani collection, and I'm very pleased to say she's a trustee of the Iran Heritage Foundation. And Ina is one of the co-curators of the Epic Iran exhibition, and she's responsible for the modern and contemporary part. Well, thanks to both of you for joining us today. A warm welcome to you, and with that, I'll hand over to Ina. Ina.
Thanks so much, John. Astrid, for this invitation. And I'm really absolutely thrilled to be able to have this moment with Charles, who, as you know, is possibly the world leading authority on the Shahnameh. He's through decades of help. And actually, I just wanted to say it was Charles's 70th birthday on Monday. So happy birthday to you, Charles. I think we celebrated then.
Well, it's a bit of a number.
It's just a number. It's just a number. Forever 27, we decided.
Yeah.
Anyway, we're thrilled to be introducing you. As you know, one of the great themes that we're exploring in the exhibition Epic Iran is how, despite all the vicissitudes and changes and dramas in Iran's heritage and history, there is this incredibly tenacious sense of identity. And this is an identity born largely, as we present it, of geography, a continuous, population of geography, landscape, language, the Persian's been used for over 3,500 years, and story. And although the Shahnameh by Ferdowsi was written 1010, it is based on much older stories. And I'm really pleased that Charles here is going to give us a kind of an informal and rather chatty run through the importance of the Shahnameh, and we're going to continue right on to today. Now, Astrid, is my screen sharing now? Can everyone see this?
Yes.
Yeah, perfect. Okay. So kings and heroes, poets and lovers. Charles, I hand over to you.
Well, thank you, Ina. Of course, this is a conversation rather than a diatribe, and I'm under strict instructions not to be boring. So the first thing, I'm sure everybody knows who Ferdowsi is, but he was, in very brief terms, operating near modern-day Mashhad at Tus, where he was a private landowner, and he was, in other words, importantly, working outside a court environment. So he wasn't a court poet and a panegyrist like many of the other poets who at that time were attracted to the court of Mahmud of Ghazna. And this is a jolly picture of what goes on in Ghazna in the old days. And essentially, he was relying on oral stories and almost certainly bits of written episodes as well from this great epic which he was pulling together. And the context, very, very briefly, was simply that Arabic had taken over as the language of culture since the Islamic invasions, the Arab invasions in the 7th century. So he's writing nearly 300 years after that. And the political climate had changed as well. And so although he was brought up and born in a Sasanian under the Samanids, who were a Persian dynasty and started to promote Persian language, they'd been eclipsed by the end of the 10th century by Turks, which of course sets the scene brilliantly for one of the main threads running through at least the early part of the Shahnameh, which is this Iran-Turan rivalry and really endless cycles of warfare. So that's in a nutshell who he was. And this is this great, wonderful story or series of stories arranged under 50 reigns of the 50 kings going back to Keomas I, right up to Yazdegerd III, who was murdered by a miller. And so it tells really largely mythical and legendary stories, but very important in many ways for explaining and understanding how Persian culture and Iranian culture really evolved since then. And we've got quite a few pictures, not that many. We've got so much to say about them that I'm worried that we won't get through. So perhaps we ought to have a next slide, Ida.
Oh, we will. I just want to say that right from the beginning here, you have this thing of the Persian and the non-Persian side by side in the epic. And I think that's the other thing that's really interesting, that the ethnicity isn't fundamental to this notion of identity.
Yeah, so John already mentioned that some of these stories are very ancient, and it's partly the story and partly the image. And of course, the Shahnameh, Book of Kings, or sometimes King of Books, it is celebrating kingship and the attributes of kingship, one of which, of course, is being a great warrior. And these wonderful Sasanian silver dishes, of course, are far earlier than any written modern Persian or New Persian record on the left. And on the right, this famous story of Bahram Gur with Azadeh and his hunting exploits. And this we've got one or two other images of this story from later in the collection and later in the slideshows. And so this is a story of great antiquity. At the very latest, this must be 7th century, from the reign of Bahram Gur himself, the Sasanian ruler. And it carries right through as a story. And it brings in the role of women immediately, which I know is something Ina is going to be interested in bringing up, but here she is right from the beginning. Ina, would you like to tell the story?
Well, not necessarily. I mean, the great thing about the Shahnameh is that it's essentially the world's longest lyrical poet in a poem in some ways, and it really deals with things like warfare and heroism and royal administration and the fallibility of kings very often. But it's punctuated throughout by women who are named and who clearly have a huge amount of autonomy, and who and it kind of, for me as a woman, it always begs, what else is going on? What are you reading into these characters that isn't explicitly said within the story? So you have Azadeh, who is the daughter of the king of Turan, becomes the consort of Bahram Gur. So again, she's already a foreigner. She's coming in, and rather than admiring him, right, she admonishes him, and Bahram Gur has his revenge on her. But of course, Bahram is then told off, and we find out that she herself, is the person who Azadeh, the freedom. She is free to express her own truth. You don't sound very convinced.
Yeah, so, well, anyway, so the point is these are very ancient stories, but the earliest record of them, visual record, is in some of these dishes. And here, the idea behind this slide is to show how It was also clearly on ceramics. This is the famous Freya beaker with the story of Bijan and Manije told as a sort of comic strip, dating earlier than any surviving manuscript record. And so it's a sort of change of material from the physical, if you like, material to actually being written down. Because although these are the earliest known illustrated copies, they're also among the earliest known written copies. I mean, there's no surviving manuscript earlier than 1217, and that's incomplete. So there's a very long gap, you see, not only between the time of Ferdowsi writing the epic, finishing around 1010, and these early manuscripts another 200 years after that with the first pictures.
Charles, do you want to tell us a little bit about what we suspect happened to the libraries that were destroyed by the series of,
yes,
particularly by the Mongols?
Well, there's several nice points here, because one, of course, is that although these are the first manuscripts, there must undoubtedly have been others which were destroyed. But before quickly mentioning that, we know there were paintings, not necessarily in manuscripts. So we have this account by Ibn Asfandiar, who was the chronicler of Tabaristan in northern Iran, and he refers to one of the palaces of the kings of Tabaristan. He was writing in the early 12th century, who had someone who recited the Quran in the day and the Shahnameh at night, and there were paintings in his palace of stories of Shahnameh. So clearly, and of course going back much beyond that to the famous murals at Panji, Kent. So in other words, there is a visual tradition that goes back a very long way before it hits these manuscripts. But as Ina sort of noted, I mean, the fact is we know that there was a terrible destruction of libraries under the Mongols, partly in Merv. The geographer Yakut was fleeing from Merv, where he was using the library as the Mongols advanced. And then also the description of the sack of Baghdad under Hulagu, where apparently the Tigris was, all these wonderful pages of manuscripts floating down the river. So it's highly unlikely there weren't earlier copies than these, whether they were illustrated or not. But these happen to be the earliest ones that we know. And by chance from the exhibition, the beaker shows the story of Bijan and Manije, and the picture in the middle there is also a story from Bijan and Manije at the beginning, where he's sent off to the borders of Turan to deal with these wild boars.
It's also very interesting too, and I'm sure we'll see the contrast here with these landscape portraits. So the Mongols, having destroyed all the libraries, as you said, the Tigris was running black with the ink from the books that
yes.
the libraries are destroyed. They then decide that they're going to become Iranian. They become the greatest erasers. They convert to Islam. They start learning Persian. They propagate the Shahnameh, the reinvention of the Shahnameh. But very often, as their image making and their guide on those paintings, they're using, Central Asian and further Eastern, guidelines. So the scroll painting, which gives you these landscape paintings.
And you can see in a way, without dwelling too long on any one slide, but if you see these early pictures, they're relatively simple. I mean, they're a sort of a strip across the page. They could almost be telling the story multiple scenes. Whereas when we see some of the later pictures, they completely dominate the page, and the art has taken over from the written word, as it were.
Yeah. So by the time we get to the Timurids, actually no, let's stay with the Mongols, because we still then have the great Mongol Shahnameh, and we're dying for Robert Hillenbrand's huge monograph to come out on these. But tell us about the importance of these paintings.
Well, you see, this is an absolute not a bugbear of mine, but I mean a sort of running theme through all the sort of tedious articles I've written, that it's not a coincidence that these manuscripts date from the Mongol period. You might think how extraordinary that why would the Mongols bother? But the Mongol period makes a very important transition. For a start, it's the end of the Caliphate. So it's the end of Iran just being a province of the Abbasid Empire. And really, in a sort of paradoxical way, I mean, I think Iran was set free by the Mongols. In other words, they're looking east again instead of being caught up with being the fag end of an Islamic empire based in the West. And of course, they were complete outsiders of very low cultural low cultural attainment. And so for the Persians, who are extremely sophisticated, they had to somehow show their conquerors what it actually meant to be a Persian, and relating the stories of Shahnameh and the whole importance of kingship. And one important aspect of this is the significance of Iskandar, Alexander the Great. So the picture on the right here is showing the mourning for the death of Alexander. And of course, he was one of the great world conquerors, or perhaps the great world conqueror. And so to present to the Mongols the idea that Genghis Khan and his followers were simply another wave of this, and they could somehow be accommodated that way and sort of, legitimized, because they just represent another conqueror who's taken over the Persian Empire and, as I say, in a strange sort of way, liberated it to be, despite the destruction. I mean, Iran goes its own way after the Mongol conquest. It's no longer just a part of the Arab world and the caliphate.
And
it's a very important stepping stone, this. So it's not only the earliest manuscripts we have from the Mongol period, but the earliest illustrations as well. It's quite obvious what's going on, that despite the destruction, actually, this is when this amazing flourishing of visual art and the arts of the book actually gets going, because under Islam, really, there wasn't anything like this. There was only sort of technical drawings and manuals and star charts and things, but no illustration of narrative poetry or narrative texts.
Or that we know. I mean, you've already hinted at palaces, and you've got the ceramics with plenty of, narrative text. So this is where it re-enters book art, and book art takes a new fold. And so here you have the Mongols, having conquered, doing what all the conquerors of Iran do, which is sort of, become Iranian, out Iranian, the Iranians, if you want.
In theory. Yeah, well, this is two wonderful pictures here, and the title is a sort of reference to the point, because we think of the Timurids in artistic terms as being incredibly sophisticated. I mean, this wonderful Juki manuscript on the left, painted by the grandson of Timur, not by him, for him. And on the other hand, it was still an age of considerable brutality. I mean, these were Mongols, and there was this wonderful conflict that probably is what stimulated the art of the period, the sort of tension between sort of nomadic roots, or the sort of, the Chagatais were blood-sucking evil monsters as far as many people are concerned. And on the other hand, this high civilization and culture that developed, especially towards the latter part of the 15th century. And I think this tension is what gives the art so much drama in a way. It was, it was born out of quite a cultural struggle. I'm sure some of you are familiar with Maria Subtelny's brilliant book called The Timurids in Transition. And the whole transition went on for, centuries in a way. And are we going to become civilized, or are we going to go on being brutal? And of course, the pictures in the Shahnameh, this one on the right is really terrific. Big head Shahnameh shows that the interest in battle continued.
Yeah, and what's also interesting in this Timurid thing is that you have these different schools in the different cities, as all the princes vie with each other to the best manuscript workshop, and you get different styles. So and that's also interesting. And the technologically, by now the production of paper is first class. They understand pigments and how to lay them down that they last. And some of the certainly by the second half of the 15th century, we get some absolutely beautiful manuscripts that look just as beautiful, crisp today as they did then. And case in point, the Bithsad here on the right.
Yes, so here you see, this is, there was a shift from interest purely in the epic and the martial exploits, and romantic literature becomes more prominent, especially thanks to Nizami. And you see on the left, we have the dish again, showing the story of Bahram Gur. And here we have a manuscript image of the same story much later. She's sitting there playing her harp. while he's going through his feats. But Nizami took many of the stories. So the point is, it's not just Nizami starting writing romances. He's actually rewriting many of the stories that were in the Shahnameh and developing them and developing their romantic nature, but also their, well, in a more, probably I'd say in a more sophisticated way, in a way. I mean, penetrating deeper into the characterization of the protagonists. And yes, so these are both, this one and the next, they're stories that are from the Shahnameh, but reworked by Nizami. And as Dina was saying, you can see there's a much more sophisticated treatment of visually than in the previous ones.
Well, I think especially by the time you go to the painting on the right, you're seeing layers and layers, you know, I mean, you have depth and you have, you know, distinction of character, and it's very busy, and, you know, the balance and the composition of the work is outstanding, let alone, you know, preparing us in a way for the flourishes of the Safavid manuscripts to come.
Mm.
Oops, yeah. I jumped too forward. Sorry.
Yeah, you went twice. Yeah.
There you go. Sorry, Charles. I didn't mean to.
No, that's fine. This is really just carrying on the previous point. I mean, the Nizami, this is the story of Khosrow and Shirin, and wonderfully elegant and beautiful pictures. And the story of Khosrow and Shirin in Ferdowsi is very short and a rather, well, it's rather remarkable, of course, but it's not like this. This is far more of a romance. And Nizami gives it a far greater treatment. I mean, a whole, one of his whole romantic stories in his Khamsa is devoted to it. And on the right, we have the scene of the minstrel Barbad playing at the court, and he was at the court in the Ferdowsi stories as well. And so it's really just to show, and they're both in the exhibition. I mean, it's just nice to be able to see the influence both visually and textually of the Shahnameh and Ferdowsi's work, even if they're totally different works, basically.
And then we go on to how the kind of the narrative structure begins to influence more than just poetry and storytelling itself. Tell us about how this jump in the use of the kind of the composition of stories goes.
Yes, well, of course, the hero was different, but the idea was the same in a way. I mean, this Shahnameh, it's a very interesting text, and the author, who was writing in the environs of Herat, but again, not at court. I mean, he's a slightly Ferdowsian figure. He spent his time on his estate, and although certainly a Shi'i, in still a basically Sunni environment. And he starts his epic, this Shahnameh, with saying how Ferdowsi appeared in a dream and he was dressed like this, and the author, Ibn Hussam, was inspired. But of course, the hero is no longer Rustam. He says everything about Ferdowsi's poem was brilliant, except he picked the wrong hero, and the hero should be Ali. And so the Shahnameh is actually a story of Ali and his compatriots and his colleagues going out to convert people to Islam. And even the names, Tahmas and some of the other characters in the poem among the heathens or the non-Muslims have Shahnameh names, but the whole meter and the layout, you can see this could be a Shahnameh manuscript. And the language is very similar, but of course it's appropriating the idea of a heroic fighter, but transferring it to the Imams, and the one on the right, really even more so. This is Imam Reza doing something terrific from a book of omens, but it could be, if it wasn't for the flaming halo, which is the characteristic of the Imams. Here we have a heroic figure spearing a horrible-looking demon, which could be straight out of the Shahnameh. So by now, I think we can already see that it's we're a long way from the Shahnameh, but not from the world of the Shahnameh. It's just the characters are different, the story's different, but visually, the influence of those early paintings, which were dedicated to the Book of Kings, are now being appropriated by the artists. And this is a full page painting, of course, and the one on the left is taking up more and more of the space. So sort of privileging the visual over the textual on the page.
Yeah, and the function of illustration in terms of, you know, being part of that storytelling. Tell me, this story on the left, which is extraordinary when he looks at it. So you have Omar cross-dressing in order to seduce a heathen king. I mean, is that something that we see quite often?
Well, I haven't noticed that actually, you know, so well spotted. I wouldn't have thought there was all that much of that going on actually, but who knows?
I mean, it's so woke. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, it's funny anyway, yes. It's nice he's called Omar. There are one or two others. It's not the real Omar, I don't think, but you know, yeah.
So here, the great, you know, the great Safavid Shahnameh examples here. I mean, read it, you know, talk us through the three of them.
Well, the interesting thing, I mean, apart from the quality of the paintings here, is that some of the earlier ones we've seen princely commissions, which on the whole weren't terribly common after the latter half of the 15th century. I mean, the later Timurids, especially Shah Sultan Hussein, we don't think there's a Shahnameh commissioned by him. So that was going on at the princely courts and in the provinces, but not again as a royal patronage. But these three manuscripts are all from royal patronage. Actually, they're in the wrong order in a sense, but obviously this wonderful Shah Tahmasp one has to be in the middle. But there are three royal productions. The Shah Tahmasp one is the first in the middle there, from Ina's collection. It's absolutely staggering finish and color and the inventiveness of the way that it's all bulging out of the margins and so on. On the right, we have Shah Ismail II, who was the successor of Shah Tahmasp, and didn't last very long. He just had a very brief reign, but he already commissioned a Shahnameh, which again is actually rather an interesting one. And then on the left, we have Abbas II, who succeeded Shah Safi, so the grandson of Shah Abbas. So all three are commissioning Shahnamehs. And this is, well, it makes the point again that this is very much seen as a royal thing. If you were a ruler, you did one of these. And the motive is to show yourself as a great ruler in the mold of the heroes of the past. And of course, they made very nice presents too. And as we know, Ina's one in the middle, this fabulous from the Shah Tahmasp Shahnameh. This was ended up in Istanbul. It was a present from Tahmasp to his opposite number in Shah Suleiman, Sultan Suleiman, on coming to the throne and congratulating him. Or his successor, sorry, it was later.
It has, and it's had an extraordinary journey. It's definitely not mine. Please don't call it mine. You know,
well, you know, it's got Sarikhani under it.
Let's call it. But the fact that it went to the Ottomans, you know, then through the Rothschilds, and then, you know, finally to the Dila Houghton, who dismembered it, you know, very sadly, and dispersed it, and we're very pleased to be able to show paintings of this quality, which might otherwise not be seen. But in each case, what you see is an extraordinary quality of inventiveness, you know, both technically, compositionally, you know, and really, it's interesting also to see how, you know, the workshop, whoever was in charge of that decision, which stories they chose to illustrate, you know. So
yes,
and the battles, which are important, and then the second one, Rustam passing judgment on the murder of Siavash, where he goes, I will not put you to death, and your punishment will be that you will have to live your life knowing what you did. And finally, this beautiful painting of the Seymour coming to her death on that cruel barbarity, and the tension, that vertical tension across the top of the painting, echoing, you know, the knives of her death. It's what appeals to each patron in what they want to have depicted within it.
And another interesting point actually is that although the Shah Tahmasp in the Sarikhani collection, most of the paintings have been attributed by some very great connoisseurship and scholarship by Anthony Welsh, or the other Welsh, sorry,
Yeah,
which one?
Yeah.
Yeah. They're not signed, whereas the Shah Ismail one on the right, Ismail II, all the names of the painters are written on the painting. And I think this is, so we know exactly who was working in the atelier under Ismail II. And even if they're not actually signed by the artist, they're certainly attributed by the contemporary, you know, he knew who'd done them. So it's not a case of working it out from the hand and the style. They're actually all there, and sometimes they're written rather discreetly in the saddle of a horse or whatever. But they're all attributed to a known artist working at this workshop, some of whom, of course, were working earlier.
Yeah. And I guess, you know, by now also for the patron to show off who he's managed to attract into his workshop. Right?
Yeah.
So look at me, I've got a Leonardo, you know.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Well, this is particularly interesting to me. I mean, this is where, if I'm going to get boring, this is the danger of getting the whole issue of genre. You see, one of the questions that endlessly flows around all this is the Shahnameh really history at all? Can we call it history? Because, of course, it's written 200 years after the event of the last event in the Shahnameh. I mean, the murder of Yazdagierd III, well, actually 400 years after that. And it's referring to events that took place thousands of years before, if they happened at all. And is this really history? And of course, it's a view of history. I mean, it's a sort of philosophical text about what history is all about, but it's not narrative history in the normal sense of the word. I mean, it's not a list of dated events. But of course, history books started to be illustrated as well. I mean, pure history books, if you like, written by people who thought they were writing factual history about their own times or about the past. And so here we've got a wonderful example of this juxtaposed, because they're both paintings in the Sarikhani collection, and they're both from the same manuscript. But one is the story of Rustam and pulling the Khan of China off his white elephant on the left, and the other is Shah Ismail defeating his enemies, the Ark-Guyunli. So in other words, one is antiquarian history, if you like, it's a sort of a fable, and the other is more or less contemporary history. It's as near as many of the Safavid manuscripts actually got to illustrating contemporary history. And without the text, you see, that makes it even more explicit in a way, that this could be almost anything. I mean, this picture on the right could also be a story from the Shahnameh, and it's just conceivable that the story on the left could have been some battle in India in real life, you know, and there was a white elephant. So it does make the point about the genre of history and history writing, and the poetry, of course, of Ferdowsi is one thing, but Khan Damir was writing in prose. So the stories of these universal histories, they start with Shahnameh stories, and they end up, and then the rise of Islam right through until you get to more or less contemporary history. But one reason we believe that there isn't much contemporary history illustrated in contemporary Safavid chronicles is because they were using the patronage of the Shahnameh as a sort of surrogate. So it was like a way of depicting contemporary history, but in the guise of the past. So the rulers, you know, the manuscripts painted in the reign of Shah Abbas, they all have a Shah Abbas moustache, and the features are clearly the features of the time, and the material cultures of the material culture of the time. It's not an antiquarian effort to reconstitute what it was actually like in the Sasanian period. So it's a sort of a way of looking at history through the eyes of the past. It's, or another way of putting it, saying using the past for its contemporary purpose. These are the kings. This is what they look like. Look, they look like me. Their court looks like my court. So you don't actually need to illustrate some boring history book, which very few people are going to read, but you might as well illustrate yourself in a Shahnameh manuscript. So that's why these 2 pages complement and contrast each other so nicely, I think.
I think they're absolutely brilliant, and I think you illustrate that point very well. And of course, you know, something similar was happening in Europe at the time. So you have Veronese showing, you know, the Last Supper in an Italian villa,
exactly.
or you have Shakespeare talking about Antony and Cleopatra as a kind of a prism for you know 16th century politics. So it's not so different. It's just done in a different way. And as you say, you know, fact and fiction merging, and saying something much more about their own times than about history.
Yes, and of course, just briefly following on from that, I mean, the point is there's no attempt to be naturalistic. I mean, even with the modern history, I mean, one doesn't need to believe for a moment it looked like that, the battles. So just it's pure imagination. I mean, and there's even less attempt in the Persian art as it has developed to pay any real attention to what you might call reality. I mean, some of them, they have pink horses and blue horses and, you know, all the rest of it. So it's not as though this is even of any documentary value for a picture of what really happened at the battle.
I don't know, maybe you just need to learn more about horses, Charles.
Well, maybe there really are blue horses out there somewhere, yeah.
And so we continue, and you know what you call the rest is history, and how this continuing legacy goes on into the Qajar period.
Well, this is the one on the left is a very direct example, because as we know, after the Safavids, we have a bit of an unpleasant interlude in Iran in the 18th century, and then the Qajars rise to power. And Fath Ali Shah, the first sort of established Qajar ruler, one of the first things he does is produce, or commission, I should say, this Shahnameh. So it's even better than the Shahnameh. You really are the Shah now. And again, it's completely in the idiom of the Shahnameh. And you can see just from the layout of the page, it's a verse chronicle, and it's the exploits of Fath Ali Shah. And clearly positioning himself as picking up the threads of the Safavid period and earlier traditions of legitimacy and propaganda, and sort of glossing over the sort of unfortunate period that preceded the rise of the Qajars, and plugging himself in absolutely into the sort of sequence of new dynasties and Iranian monarchs. It's the poor old Russians who are getting it instead of the Turks, but essentially the idea is the same. And the picture on the right is this terrific tabletop. There was one actually also from the V&A collection in the exhibition we had in the Fitzwilliam Museum in 2010. These tiles, and you can see the tile that has been highlighted there. This shows the story of Rustam pulling the Khan of China off his elephant. So this is again just a sort of lovely reminder of the continuity of these stories. That there we have it in the Habiba Siyar, written in that 1524, 25, something round about there. And here we have it again, 350 years later, the same story is still being illustrated. So I think this just shows as clearly as anything can be, both in text and in visual examples, how the Shahnameh lives on, even though the text is no longer there, and you know, it's all so long ago, but it's still being produced in propaganda. It's still being produced in decorative art for, you know, tabletops. I think people are going to the domestic furniture, you could say. It's fantastic.
It's a hell of a piece of domestic furniture. I'd love one like that. But I mean, the is
well, it depends sort of domestic arrangements you have.
Yeah, but I mean, the other thing is look at Rustam. Look at that beard. Where's that beard coming from?
Well, it's coming from Fath Ali Shah. Well, no, it can't be Fath Ali Shah by then, of course.
Maybe.
I don't know what sort of beard Nasruddin Shah had. I can't remember if he had a great beard.
He didn't. He had a clash. He had a little...
Yeah, but you're right. Well, anyway, this is also that point. I mean, it's contemporary, isn't it? It's that old story, but in contemporary guise.
And the armor and the placing and the sword, all of those kind of issues. And then we move on in this lovely little segue into the continuing. So tell me why you chose the Khosrow here.
Well, here simply because it's Khosrow again. In fact, it's the story of. I think this is Farhad really is doing the. Oh no, that's the one on the right. Yes. So, well, the point about this is really simply that it's a nice painting again with this Khosrow doing something kingly. If you remember right from the beginning, we had the Sasanian rulers killing lions, and now we have this heroic, the king of men killing the king of beasts. But it's been again appropriated into the 19th century by the new margins and the lovely borders that have been put on it. So it's something, again, this is an old artifact that is still treasured 250 years after it was produced. And then, as you say, segueing into the story on the right, which you'd better tell us about, but it picks up this part of the title of the talk, which is about poets and beloveds, as well as just kings and lions.
Well, much more to be, much better, I think, to be a poet or a beloved or a lover, or a beloved.
Well, that's the best of all, of course, yeah.
So the vast majority of objects illustrated so far in this lecture, of course, are going to be at Epic Iran. So and not less this amazing sculpture by Parviz Tanavoli, and the three that are going to come on the next page. And the great thing about this is that Parviz Tanavoli went to study abroad in Italy, and he viewed himself as a sculptor. And of course, although there's an incredible wealth of art, there isn't that same tradition of sculpture in Iran. You don't have the figures in the churches or the boulevards lined with famous heroes of the past as you go through them. And he went back to Iran and he toyed and played around in trying to find who was the authentic voice for him. And he stumbled across Farhad, and of course we know Farhad was the sculptor and architect who came to the court of Khosrow and Shirin, and fell in love madly with the Queen Shirin. And there's a wonderful moment where he doesn't even see her to fall in love. He's standing outside the door and he hears her laughter, and at the sound of her laughter, that's it. He collapses to the floor and he's completely enamored of her, and then tries to win her hand through great acts of architecture and bravery, and carrying her over muddy puddles and carving into the mountain. But of course, as we know, having read our Nizami, he never quite wins her, and she stays faithful to her king. And in this rendition, of course, he's remaking it. So there's a fantastic thing where it shows, the poet, which is a symbol for Farhad, and he has snared his Shirin. Can you see that grip around her waist? And then her two yellow discs on the one on the right is written Limu, which is, as any Iranian will know, is slang for boobies. And that red arrow, clearly shows that finally Farhad has his satisfaction. It's a fantastic bit of early Sarikhani work, reappropriating these myths and recreating them with found objects. And I do hope you'll all come and see it. But one of the other things that's interesting, and we've got three here, we have three works here, first on the left by Khosrow Hassanzadeh, and then second in the middle, Ali Bani Sadr, and third on the right, Shiva Ahmadi. And when we don't have this Khosrow, this Hassanzadeh is in actually Mo's collection. We're having a different one in the exhibition. But what you see is that the way that the Shahnameh and this incredible history of myth and legend lives on isn't just in a literal retelling of the stories. There are more subtle and lateral and subliminal ways that these stories live on. So we are used to, from ancient monuments, where it's Persepolis, where you see the king in mortal combat, and we've seen the kind of we've now seen Rustam and the white Deev, and we've seen Ali and the Deev, And in the last one, we see Khosrow and the lion. And really, this idea of the hero is so embedded in Persian culture, of the pahlavan, you know, the warrior. Of course, except now we're not fighting deers and lions, but what we are doing is reenacting and reperforming those acts of heroism and ritual and manliness through these through the the wrestling and the Zurkhane history of that. And that's a really, really powerful thing. Ali Bani Sad, you know, touches the Shahnameh in other ways. You know, he talks a lot about how the myths and, you know, I mean, he's just got exhibition opening now, and he talks about Seymour again, about how they influence his way of seeing things. Except, and if you look at this incredible painting that is going to be an Epic Iran, what you see is that flurry and dynamism, as we've seen on some of those best of the Shahnameh pages. So, and what on one hand looks like it could be chaos is actually a painting of extreme discipline and tension. So when you stand before it, you see how he has mastered that kind of skill of the smaller page painter on a large canvas. All of this movement, and yet it is not chaotic at all. It creates movement. It evokes feelings. It evokes emotions, and has an incredible powerful effect. And it's really hard not to look at a Shahnameh page there. And then on the right, we have this oil barrel by Shiva Ahmadi. And she is obviously having quite an ironic take on the power of oil and the wealth of the kings now, you know, of our non-king kings in Iran, but certainly of the Pahlavis and under the Islamic Republic. The wealth of the nation rests on this thing. And here she is in this tradition of, again, miniature painting and Shahnameh, reenacting those forms on the oil barrel. So taking it from some smelly, ugly thing, which power often is, and subjugation of the kings often is, and the fallibility of kings often is, and trying to make something beautiful of it on it. And on other oil barrels, she has much more literally, you know, the king in combat on the oil barrel. And yet, when you look into it and you look at that, there is a gash in the middle of the oil can, in that central disc in the middle of the oil can, and it's dripping. And again, this speaks to this idea of the things that we admire and we find noble actually being the things that we fail to do, or that power and kingship fails to do. So I just think it's interesting, you know, how very different and yet how persistent this mythology of the kings is. So do come and see them. But Charles, we call this lecture Kings, Hero, Poet, Love, and I did warn you I was going to do this to you. Your favorite king?
Well, my favorite king is Khosrow, I think, probably, because I like the way he ends up, you know, just disappearing in a snowstorm is quite cool, and he's renounced his power. I just like to say, I mean, I don't know, I've got lots, I quite like Bijan too, although he's a bit of a mixed blessing. On the modern side, of course, this is very interesting to see. I suppose what you could say in a way, if Ferdowsi was alive now, he might be preoccupied with some of these themes, you know, the sort of topics that were of concern to him would still be of concern, and he might do it this way. But of course, there's also a huge body of interest of artists in Iran who are more directly, you know, using the iconography of Shahnameh, more recognizable characters, and I suppose more of a sort of a calque. I mean, I don't mean the sort of pretty sort of fake miniature paintings, which are just sort of pale reflections of the real thing, but you know, some dramatic modern artists using Shahnameh stories in taking them on board in a more direct way. This is a very nice indirect reflection of them, I guess, apart from perhaps the Khosrow Hassanzadeh piece. And the IHF did actually support a very nice exhibition in Tehran a few years ago, which Ferdowsi Melville helped curate. And we got something else coming up in BIPS in November, also of contemporary artists using the Shahnameh in a different way from this. I mean, they're both equally stimulating. I think it's really nice to imagine the themes being picked up, but not so much directly the iconography. and the words, of course, as well. Although there are many modern paintings where the calligraphy also reflects specifically the stories. There's no question that it goes on and on and on, and it would be interesting to see what the next iteration of this is. But yeah, so I don't know. Do you have a favorite? Do you have a favorite character? You must like Ghordar Farid, I imagine.
Well, of course. I
Or
mean,
some heroic lady like that.
she was fantastic. I mean, you know, and she certainly was. But I mean, actually, you know, so many of the women are so driven and do their own thing. I mean, even Ruda Ben Sindort, you know, who defy, you know, whatever they want to do. You know, they decide that, you know, they've got their eye set on Zal. They go out and do it. They negotiate it. You know, they and Mihrab, who is the descendant of Zahag, is actually just weak and pathetic. And very often, I think, in confrontation with the women, the men seem kind of weak or foolish
or even very weak and very foolish.
Yeah. So
yes, one interesting thing, we haven't actually seen a picture of it, and we probably shouldn't digress too far, but when you see the Mongol period and even a little bit later, you do get women actually depicted in the manuscript paintings, especially in the Ilkhanid period, the Mongol period, and in the histories as well. But as you progress through time, especially by the time you get to the Safavids, the women are rubbed out visually again, unless they're just occasionally you get a dancing girl or you get someone, you know, serving a drink or something, but you don't get the consort of the ruler sitting on the throne next to him, which is interesting, and which you do in the earlier periods. So they disappear again.
And then reappear again later. I mean, it is that kind of Islamicization. Even actually within the narrative of the Shahnameh, you know, the women in the epic period rather than the historical period are much more dynamic and individuated and don't really give a toss about, you know, conventional morality, or they have their own morality, but they, you know, certainly not. They're not that. You know, they're actors.
Yeah, well, look at Tahmideh. I mean, her behaviour was so disgraceful. She had to be bowdlerized for a while.
Well, I mean, you're a father of daughters. I'm sure that you're familiar with this.
I'm sure their behaviour is exemplary, you know, on every occasion when they're out. Not that they've been out for a bit.
Your hero, does it have to be Rustam?
No, I don't. He's not my hero, actually. I mean, he's a figure, but he's a very flawed character. Bijan is as well. But of course, one of the interesting things about the Shahnameh, there's no continuous narrative. And I suppose in a way that's what I meant about Nizami. I mean, they are cardboard characters. I mean, there's some deep psychological depth in Siyavush and in moments for Rustam. But they might appear in one guise in one story and a different guise in another. I mean, of course, even Sudabe is rather an attractive character before the debacle with Siyavush. So it's not as though there's a character has developed across, of course, the enormously long period when some of them are operating. Bijan is quite a mixture of a rebellious youth and a great hero and a sort of someone who argues with his father and, you know, kills quite pleasant people and does all sorts of things. So there's no continuous development of a character across the whole epic. Yeah, I don't know.
Come on, you have to choose a hero. Would it be Siyavush? All
right, I've got to choose a hero. Well, I like Piran, actually, the good counselor of Afrasiab. He seems to be someone who is more or less portrayed in a consistent way, and he acts according to principle and in a generous way. I think he's quite admirable.
Yeah, he's here. He's in.
Yes, he may be somewhere, Piran. And of course, Bijan kills him. No, I think. Is it Bijan? Yeah. No, it's Godaz who kills him, yeah, still.
And your poet, are you going to stick with Ferdowsi?
Well, my favorite poet? Oh, well, I think probably, yes, actually. I mean, the poetry is fabulous. One shouldn't forget that. You look at all these wonderful pictures and you say, look at the pictures. But actually, even if, you know, I mean, just the poetry is fabulous, really. Yeah. You can see why it appeals.
Yeah. Great. Well, Charles, thank you very much. I know that Astrid's going to field the Q&A. I don't know if she's going to come back and and see, you know, I'm sure everyone's got hundreds of questions to ask you.
Yes, thank you very much, both of you. That was really, really interesting discussion. And we have had a few questions come in. We've got a bit of time. Quite a few people have asked if the recording will be available. So it will be up on the IHF website in the next day or two. So do visit the website to find that. One of the questions that has come in is, scholars have contended that Ferdowsi's main concern was the preservation of the pre-Islamic legacy of myth and history. Do you agree? Also, what, if anything, did Ferdowsi know about the Achaemenids?
Ah, well, the first point, definitely. I mean, this is an act of well, it's a memory. I mean, it's preserving a memory. And again, we didn't really go into the context particularly, but these stories were in serious danger of getting lost. That's why the oral, I think he goes to such lengths at the beginning and at beginning of various different episodes to say that he heard it from a Dehgan or a Mobad, you know, the ancient stories which are being preserved, and he's writing them down. And therefore preserving them in that way. And of course, it's very, you know, as we said, he's actually writing this in 1010, which is almost 400 years after the fall of the Persian Empire. I mean, he could have gone on and written the epic of what happened next, but it was a bit dreary from the Persian point of view. So he was recovering the past or preserving the past, I think, in terms of story and in language. You know, as Ina said, the language is so important. He was really using it, one of the first to use it as a vehicle for cultural activity, for communicating something that wasn't just sort of mathematics or you know, prayers or something like that. And as for the second question, which I've already forgotten.
What if anything did Ferdowsi?
Oh, he knew nothing about the Achaemenids. This is actually a nice point to have raised, because we were discussing this before it started. Nobody knew anything about the Achaemenids. They were rediscovered basically in the 19th century by when the great inscriptions were written. You know, Persepolis was called Taxi Jamshid. They knew it was a great palace by an ancient king, but it was associated, and this is such an interesting point, actually. I'm glad we had a chance to mention it. They didn't know that it was the palace of Darius. They thought they associated it with Jamshid. And Naqshi Rustam, of course, all the carvings there, the Achaemenid tombs, and even the Sasanian tombs, that was called, they knew they were heroes in action, and it was called Naqshi Rustam. As though it was Rustam. Nobody knew anything about the Achaemenids, and they were, I suppose, they were a victim of Alexander, and then the Parthians, and really it's ancient history, very, very ancient. It was really the Parthians who preserved most of these stories, and they were rubbed out of history by the Sasanians. So the Sasanian, it's the Sasanian story we have now, the ideal of kingship and all the idea of justice and good rulership, the models, the sort of didactic message of the Shahnameh about what kingship's all about. This harks back to the Sasanian idea of kingship and the sort of circle of justice, keeping everybody in their proper place, keeping society functioning in order. Mm. This is really a Sasanian model. And the Parthians only have about 5 pages in the Shahnameh, maybe a little bit more. So yeah, it's a very interesting point. Thank you for that. Yeah, it is remarkable actually that there's no record of Cyrus the Great in the Shahnameh, which in a way would be the obvious place to start.
Yeah. Another question that's come in is, do you consider Feridun a hero or just a victorious king?
What do you think, Ina?
I mean, he certainly he certainly has his quirks, doesn't he, Charles?
Yes, I think well, I mean, his only victory really was beating up Zahak, wasn't it? Yeah. Which I suppose is a clever thing to have done. But otherwise, he's well, he made a big mistake, of course, dividing up his kingdom. That's a classic error. Yeah, so he was probably neither a hero or a clever king, actually, but he at least got rid of Zahak. Yeah, it's a bit of a frivolous answer, I know, but there isn't all that. It's actually quite short, the reign of Feridun in the Shahnameh. Again, he's one of these foundational rulers. You know, he's sort of he returns the monarchy to the Iranians after the rule of Zahak, and he tests his sons, and he, well, it's actually rather difficult to remember what else he did, to be honest. I'm sure I ought to remember a bit better what he did, but I mean, it doesn't last terribly long. And then he has this terrible mistake of dividing Iran up. And then he has to lament the murder of Iraj. And yeah, yes, I'm not sure we know enough about him to say whether he's a victorious hero or the other thing.
Do you think he was a hero before he became a king? And that's that goes back to this, you know, that you know, the defeat of Zahak was, of course, you know,
well, he wasn't doing an awful lot, was he? He was sort of having fun with a cow, and then he sort of got this mission to go and deal with Zahak.
He did it. He did it.
I don't know his yeah. Sorry, I'm being a bit flippant here because I can't actually remember the whole of the reign of Feridun off the top of my head. Of course, it's a very important part, and he is frequently invoked as a model of rulership. But it's mainly Jamshid who really sets the thing up, and Feridun, I think, is just a very interesting case. Yeah, sorry, there's probably a better answer out there in the wings.
It's good to have your opinion on it. This question's come in saying, is it that the stories of the Shahnameh were East Iranian in origin, and to what extent were they known in Persia before Ferdowsi?
Well, there's a big argument about all this, really. The stories were certainly known. I mean, he got, as we were saying, I mean, some of it is oral, or he says he's using oral sources, which is probably true because there's sort of storytelling techniques in his poetry. But essentially, some of the earlier chronicles, especially Tabari, but one or two other of the early Arab histories, these so-called universal histories, you know, which look back at the prophets and the ancient empires and then the rise of Islam. They have some of these stories in Tabari particularly. Of course, these were almost all written by Persians, but they were written in Arabic. Yes, the stories are there. And this is one very interesting thing. If one compares the bare bones of the story, like the story of Furud, for instance, which actually I've written one of my incredibly boring articles about. The story in Tabari is one thing, and Ferdowsi turns it into something else. I mean, almost in the way that Nizami develops the stories in Ferdowsi. Ferdowsi is developing the bare bones of these stories, and particularly the stories of Bahram Chubineh, which is a very long and interesting episode, actually, towards the end of the Shahnameh. It's probably one of the most interesting things, because there we have a character and you get all this dilemma about whether you should just be loyal to a king, however stupid he is, or whether really, if you're not fit to rule, you should take power yourself. And Bahram Chubineh is a very interesting character, but his story is in Tabari and the early Arabic chronicles. So the stories were definitely known and they were definitely written down. And you know, it's the extent to which Ferdowsi elaborated these and turned them into far more psychological and dramatic episodes. As for where, well, Ferdowsi was in Eastern Iran, of course, but there's a lot of, you see, there's a lot of farce in it too, the Sasanian element, and the southwestern Iran, from the seat of where the Persians were. But then, of course, Sistan, the stories of Rostam and the king, you know, he was ruler of Sistan in the southeast. But then on the other hand, you've got the Parthians who are up in the Caucasus as well. And I think it's rather difficult because there's this famous story of Vis and Ramin by Gorgani, who was, it's not exactly copying Ferdowsi's stories, but I mean, there was clearly more of a literary production going on in the Parthian period that has really survived. And many of the stories in the Shahnameh certainly have a Parthian origin. Bijan and Manija has a Parthian origin. So where they were actually pulled to, they may be written all over the place and just pulled together periodically by somebody. I know I'm not the best person to answer this question. Parvane Pourshariati would be better at it than me, and also Dick Davis, but maybe they're listening. They can put the record straight.
I can see Vesta and Nagas chomping at the bit to try and get in on.
Yes, absolutely, yes. Well, there's nothing wrong with being an Aunt Sally. If everything you said was true, it would be so boring.
So, tell me, in the Tabari version of Bijan Shubina, do we also have that debate between him and his sister Gorgia?
I'm not sure that she comes into it. I can't remember the Tabari version. I'm afraid, yeah, I can't remember. It's mainly Di Navari, actually. I think maybe he is a major source for that story, a particular one. Yes, I don't remember. I don't remember, I'm afraid, Yeah.
So Vesta's saying that Feridun is the Avestan Tritona, and Narges is also mentioning the fact that a lot of these stories here go back to Avestan and Zoroastrian text. So, really in the heart of, the Persianate world rather than
exactly
the Eastern world. And I think that's important to remember.
I'm aware that we've run slightly over, so I'm just going to take two quick ones. You mentioned Dick Davis. There's been a couple of people asking whether there is an English translation that you would recommend in particular.
Well, that would be Dick Davis's translation, par excellence. Yeah. It's not complete, of course, but they cut out bits, but it's always, you can't translate the whole damn thing, you still be at it.
It's too long. It's too long. Who wants to read all of it?
Well, some people think it is literally too long. It's too long to be any good, but actually, of course, that's not true. I mean, even the bits you cut out, it's full of nice poetry and some very interesting episodes. But still, it's a wonderful translation.
And then just very quickly, a couple of people have asked, Charles, whether your Shahnameh project will become available online again.
Yes, well, thank you. Actually, this is a good moment to say, because we've had endless, requests when it's coming back online. The problem is, of course, it's a wonderful site, but it's very elderly, and it was assembled in an ad hoc sort of way over a long period, and and the person who's mainly dealing with it suddenly pushed off without any warning at all, and left me high and dry. And we've staggered on for quite a while, but it's now more or less inoperable because it's sitting on the university library servers, and they think it's the site itself is a security risk to the whole Cambridge network, which would be quite cool. But so the good news is we have a wonderful helper from the university library, Hugh Jones, in the IT department, and it's slowly getting transferred from our old site to a new site in the Cambridge Digital Library. And in fact, there is a live site now. Of course, it's only, this is all being taken over slowly bit by bit. And actually, it's only Firuza and me who can access the old site. So we're sort of going through it, trying to get it up to date, because once it's shifted to the new site, that will be different. And we'll lose some of the information, but the less important. So it is actually there now. If you go to the Cambridge Digital Library, it's one of the projects that has its own site. But as I say, it's still in progress, but at least there's something there. There's an upload every month, going through, tidying it up and putting it across. So some of it will be there if you want to take a look. I think actually it'll be better in the end, because it's got some functions that we didn't have, and there is scope for developing it. But the main thing is to protect the data and get it all across. So thank you for that. Yes, it is actually there, and we have a development site, which is the sort of halfway stage between the old site and the live site. Yeah.
Great. Well, I'm afraid I think we'll have to stop it there. I'm sorry if we didn't manage to get.
We've only had 50,000 verses. We need at least.
I've gone through everything.
Do 50,000 episode, an episode.
Yeah, 50, yes. Yeah, we haven't done all the kings yet. I'm sorry about Ferdowsi. I mean, I knew he was in the Avesta, but I didn't remember that he did much in the Avesta, but maybe he did more.
I think you need to revisit him. See, there's always more to learn, isn't there, Charles?
Well, it definitely is. We haven't stopped yet, even age 70. It's clearly I've got a lot to learn.
Well, there's been quite a few happy belated birthdays.
Oh, well, thank you for
well,
that.
so,
Yeah.
But yes, if anybody has any further questions, feel free to email the IHF info account, and we will pass them on to Charles and Ina.
Can you keep the Q&A, or does it disappear?
I can share it, and then we can also, if anybody gets in touch, put them in touch with you as well. And just to say that the next IHF event on the 9th of June, the details will be up on our website soon, so do keep an eye out for those. And thank you again, Charles and Ina, for a very interesting
Thank you, Astrid. Thank you, Ina. Lovely to see you.
Happy birthday.
Yes.
Oh, well, don't go on about that. I mean, really, it's 2 or 3 days ago now.
All right. Okay, thank you. Bye.
Okay, thanks a lot. Bye now. Bye-bye.